Hey everybody out there in Facebook Live land.
We're wishing for a white Christmas.
We'll see about that, but
we're not gonna get a white Christmas.
details.
Because Virginia.
Yeah. But hey everybody, so Chris and Beth here, and
Hello,
Lulu.
Lulu.
Lulu wanted to say hi, which is that's a new one for her. She usually doesn't. But yeah, we're just going to give things just a second here. We're going to have some other folks with our friends at the
Vibe Network.
Vibe
Your
Radio
show
Network.
will go live in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Log Talk Radio.
Now we have everybody together. We got Vibe Radio Network and, of course, our friends here at Facebook Live. So thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. I think this one really kind of took off.
Yeah.
A lot of people are interested tonight, which, yay, thanks for everybody for tuning in, and we hope that you enjoy what we have for you this evening. Of course, we are first and foremost here to go ahead and wish you all, Merry Christmas, Happy Yule, Happy Solstice.
Anybody go out and see the conjunction? Chris and I did.
Yes, yeah, it was really cool, actually. And you can go out with just a kind of a basic camera, zoom in a little bit, and you can distinctly see Saturn and Jupiter. It's pretty cool out there right now. And it will be all night long. So, yeah, very, very cool out there tonight. But the reason you're in here with us right now is we have stories to share with you that are kind of a little bit of a Christmas tradition going back a long way. Something that doesn't really get celebrated too much today, but we like to try and go and revel in it all the same. So, am I doing all the talking?
Maybe.
But, yeah, so we got a couple of traditional Christmas ghost stories for you tonight. And I say traditional Christmas ghost stories, the first thing that comes to mind for most people is
A Christmas Carol.
But there's so much more than that.
That's the one that was made the most popular by, of course, Charles Dickens. But the Victorian tradition of telling ghost stories around the fire was very, very popular for many years up into the 1900s until spooky season basically got moved over to Halloween. And so we're going to bring back spooky season to its traditional location in our calendar.
Yep. So getting a little ahead of ourselves. We got some of that going on here, but yeah, as usual, if you usually tune in with us, glad to have you with us. If our little show here is new to you, well, basically, go ahead, drop some notes in the chat if you want to go ahead and participate. We just keep it friendly, all that good stuff. We're happy to go ahead and chat as much as we can while we're also reading. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, we're going to be going back and forth tonight because these are, even though they're short stories, they have some length more than our normal ghost stories, so that's why we're only telling 2 tonight.
Yes, well, yeah, and they're abridged all the same. So.
Yeah, there was some editing.
Yep, but that's the way it goes. But I think it starts with you. You wanted the highlighted parts.
I did.
Yes.
All right, so think about when you're singing your Christmas carols, and a lot of the times you will actually start to hear there'll be scary ghost stories and the tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. That is the reference that is making to the telling of ghost stories during the Victorian times. And as we hear in the 1963 classic, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, he's actually listing off all of those old traditions that we might not always follow today. As it turns out, lighting and gathering around a fire and telling those ghost stories was the beloved tradition from the late 1800s into the early 1900s. We had frigid temperatures and long nights that were considered the best traditions and conditions for sharing these ghost stories. In 1891, British author and humorist Jerome actually introduced his anthology of Christmas ghost stories told after supper, and I believe it's 10 stories in that one. And the quote that leads this all off actually is that nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about the specters. So we'd like to talk about those things. Of course, the most famous, as we talked about, is Dickens' 1843, A Christmas Carol. And, of course, it was originally titled A Ghost Story of Christmas. And this is where the 4 phantoms visit curmudgeonly old Ebenezer Scrooge to scare his greedy soul straight. The supernatural literary hit was inextricably bound to the heritage of the holiday ghost story, and of course America had to come up with their own, and Henry James cemented this eerie tradition in the U.S. culture when he published The Turn of the Screw in 1898. This was a novella about a chilling series of ghostly events that befall a young governess, and begins with men gathered around the fire sharing spooky stories on Christmas Eve. It's a tradition that we said lingered into the early 20th century, including magazine publications that would always run ghost stories in their Christmas issues. And of course, we're going to bring you two of them tonight, as Chris had been hinting about on our Facebook posts.
Now, before we go and dive right into that, just a little bit more background. So where exactly did these supernatural elements come from for the Christmas holiday season as we know it today? Well, historically, December 25th was actually had a closer link to the pre-Christian festivals that honored the winter solstice than with Christianity. Mistletoe, holly berries, wreaths, and Yule logs, for instance, are all pagan symbols. As a matter of fact, in kind of just a few hundred years ago, some of the Puritan leaders even tried to abolish Christmas at one point because there was no biblical basis for celebrating the day. But obviously, here we are today, thankfully.
And 800 years later, oh look, we have a Christmas star.
Yes. Now, celebrations like Yuletide symbolically celebrate, they actually celebrate death of light and the longest night of the year. For this reason, the date was considered to be the most haunted, as the veil between the realms of the living and the dead was at its most sheer. Perhaps it's also because, without the luxury of modern medicine and healthcare, the chilly breath of death always felt a bit close during the winter, a season particularly fraught with illness. Conditions were ripe for imaginations to run wild with what might await beyond the grave. In fact, in Shakespeare's 1611 play, The Winter's Tale, Mamilius proclaims, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." So this has been an ongoing thing with the spooky stuff around the dead of the winter, like what we have today. Now, later, thanks to traditions adopted by Irish and Scottish immigrants, Halloween was embraced in the United States and designated the official spooky season, while Christmas was purified. But perhaps this year, after wrapping presents, snacking on holiday cookies, and sipping on some mulled wine, you might consider inviting loved ones to gather around the fire to share ghost stories in the spirit of tradition. To provide you with a little inspiration, we have two such traditional Christmas ghost stories for you tonight. We have abridged them from their original version, lest we be here all night long, but we think that we caught the spirit of the stories all the same. And just, speaking of spirits, cheers everybody.
Yes,
cheers. We don't hesitate to tip one or two or five back while we're doing this. So,
and for those of you who are wondering what we're drinking, this is actually a local concoction. It is the Hardywood Gingerbread Stout with eggnog.
Yep.
If you haven't had it, you haven't lived.
About 50-50 mix, but you can adjust per your taste. So, yes, always very good. Kind of a relatively new kind of Richmond tradition in the last, 4 or 5 years ago, I think they started doing that.
Yep.
Either way, really good. And, we also have some stuff from our friends down at Richbrow, the Church Hill Morning, which we have enjoyed very much, and we will be partaking in that, and also partaking in that on Christmas as well. So,
word to the wise on the Churchill Morning.
It's a 12%er, so
one.
Yeah, one's good, so you'll be good with that. Anyways,
we discovered.
Yes, our first story for this evening is actually the kit bag.
Yes. So the kit bag was written by Algernon Blackwood, and it was first published in the Pall Mall magazine in December of 1908. Please note, Pall Mall magazine had absolutely nothing to do with Pall Mall cigarettes. The only thing they shared was the name, which was actually named off of the well-known street in London. So, the kick bag. When the words "not guilty by insanity" sounded through the crowded courtroom of that dark December afternoon, Arthur Wilbraham, the leader for the triumphant defense, was not in the courtroom at the time. He received word of the verdict via Johnson, his private secretary, who carried the verdict across to his chambers. "It's what we expected, I think," said the barrister, "and personally I am glad the case is over." There was no pleasure in his defense of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity. course, it had been successful for Novell, and he no doubt felt, as everybody else felt, that Turk actually deserved the gallows. I'm glad too, said Johnson. He had sat at the court for 10 days watching the face of the man who had carried out with callous detail one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. Wilbraham glanced up at his secretary. They were more than employer and employed, they were friends. And a kind of smile, he said, "Oh yeah, I remember you're going away for Christmas, to skate and ski in the Alps. Why, if I was your age, I'd come with you." Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26 with a delicate face. He said, "I can catch the morning boat now, but that's not the reason why I'm glad the trial's over. I'm glad it's over because that man's dreadful face has positively haunted me. That white skin, a black hair brushed low over the forehead, it's a thing I shall never forget. And the description of the way that he dismembered the body and crammed and packed it with lime into that—" Wilburn interrupted. "Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow. I don't think it has. Don't think about it. Such pictures have a way of coming back when one least wants them to. Now go. Enjoy your holiday. I shall want all of your energy for my parliamentary work when you get back. And don't break your leg skiing." Johnson shook hands and took his leave, and at the door he turned suddenly, saying, "I just remembered. Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to go get one tonight, and I leave in the morning before the shops are open." Wilbraham responded, "Of course. I'll send Harry over with one in the morning, or this evening. You shall have it the moment I get home." Johnson gratefully responded, "I promise to take great care of it," delighted to think that tomorrow he'd be on the Alps enjoying himself.
Johnson dined at his club and went on to Bloomsbury. His rooms encompassed the top floor of an old, gaunt house. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. The night was even more cheerless as a cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets with a cutting east wind like he had never felt. It howled among the big, gloomy houses of the squares, and when he reached his rooms he heard it whistling over the black roofs beyond his windows. In the hall he met his landlady. "This come by a man from Mr. Wilbraham, sir." She pointed to what was evidently the kit bag, and Johnson thanked her. They exchanged best wishes for the Christmas holiday, and he took the kit bag upstairs with him. When he got upstairs, he put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, then set about putting a few things in order for his absence, and finally began packing. He liked packing, for it brought the images of snow mountains to mind and made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 days. His friend had lent him a stout canvas kit bag, sack-shaped with holes round the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless, true, and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates and climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots, and ear caps, and then on the top of these he piled his woolen shirts and underwear, his thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next in case the hotel people dressed for dinner, and then, thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused a moment to think if he had forgotten anything. It was after 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up, and he thought with a pity of the poor Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such a climate, while he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, and dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. Ah, that reminded him he must put in his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from his sitting room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen, and as he did so he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood listening still for a moment, and it was Mrs. Monk's step. She must be coming up with the last post, but then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he had come to the conclusion they were too heavy to be those of his landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. He went into his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best he could.
The kit bag was 2/3 full and stood upright on its own base like a sack of flour. For the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty, and the canvas faded and worn, and that it had obviously been subjected to rather rough treatment. He gave the matter a passing thought and went on with his packing. Once or twice he caught himself wondering who had been wandering down below, for the floor was empty and unfurnished. He was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding over the bare boards, cautiously, stealthily, and silently as possible, and the sounds had been coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a little creepy. And then, as though to emphasize this feeling, an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his white shirts, he noticed that the top of the kickbag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like the nose and a forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain? For he could not really tell exactly. Looked like hair, and it reminded him absurdly so, like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went into the front room where the light was stronger. That horrid case is on my mind, he thought. I shall be glad to get a change of scene and air. In the sitting room, however, he heard that stealthy tread upon the stairs. He realized that it was much closer than before, and however he heard it again, and it was mistakenly real. He went out to see who could be creeping about on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased, and there was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog, and he called over the banister to Mrs. Monk's, and there was no answer. His voice echoed down the dark vault of the house. Everyone was in bed and asleep, everyone except him and the owner of this soft, stealthy tread. Just my imagination, he thought. He must have been the wind, although it seemed very real and close. He went back to his packing, and it was this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up, lit another pipe, and the last before he decided it was time to turn in.
It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins, when the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes. Impressions gather on the surface of the mind, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water. Then a point is reached where the accumulated impressions become a definitive emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous, but that he had only just reached the point where he was forced to acknowledge it. He felt as though he were doing something that was strongly objected to by another person, a person who had some right to object. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, as if he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him, it distressed him, and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mountain air will cure all that. Ah, he added, still speaking to himself, and that reminds me, my snow glasses. He was standing by the door of the bedroom during this brief soliloquy, and as he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs, a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing. And at the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep, the person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? And what in the name of heaven did he want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. There was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For several minutes he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran into the light of the front room. But hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy, but at the same time a stealthy footstep of someone who did not wish to be seen. And it was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had felt became an acute, unreasoning fear. Then it turned into terror before becoming pure horror.
That was someone on the stairs then, he muttered, his flesh crawling all over, and they're now in my bedroom. His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Then, overcoming his fear, he crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud as he went, and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half fell dead against the curtains in the room that apparently held no other human but himself. "Who's there?" he called again, a voice unnecessarily loud and only just held firm. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly, and, as he saw it, he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window streaming with rain was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but rows of clothes, hanging motionless, and under the bed there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, something tripped him up. Turning with a sudden alarm, he saw the kit bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. And a few moments before it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. What in the world was the matter with everything? Were all his senses gone? A terrific gust of wind tore through at the windows, stashing the sleet against the glass with the force of a small gunshot, and then fled away, howling dismally over the roofs. "There's no one here at any rate, that's quite clear," he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the time he uttered them, he knew perfectly well that his words were not true, and that he did not believe them himself. He felt exactly as though someone was hiding, watching his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way.
He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit bag was no longer where he had left it at. It had been dragged nearer to the door. Outwardly, Johnson remained calm and master of himself to the end, pretending to the very last that everything he had witnessed had a natural explanation, or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But in his very heart he knew all along that someone had been hiding downstairs in the empty suite when he came in, that this person had watched his opportunity and then stealthily made his way up to the bedroom, and that all he saw and heard afterwards, from the moving of the kit bag to, well, the other things this story has to tell, were caused directly by the presence of this invisible person. And it was here, just when he had most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day in the courtroom of the Old Bailey became strongly to light and developed themselves in the dark room of his inner vision. Unpleasant, haunting memories have a way of coming to life again just when the mind least desires them. In the silent watches of the night, on sleepless pillows, Johnson saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, glowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision. The white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair low over the forehead. All the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into his mind, unbidden and very vivid. "This is all just nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from his chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I'm overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across to the bedroom, humming a music hall song as he went, a trifle too loud to be natural, and the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold about his heart, and he felt that every hair on his head stood up.
The kit bag lay in front of him, several feet nearer to the door than when he had left it, and just over its crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight, as though someone were crouching behind it to hide. And at the same moment the sound, like a long-drawn sigh, was distinctly audible, and the still air about him between the gusts of the storm outside. Johnson could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back, his legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost hysterical, impulse to scream aloud. The sigh seemed to be in his very ear, and the air still quivered with it. It was unmistakably a human sigh. He stepped forward so that he could see all around and over the kit bag. Of course there was nothing there, nothing but that faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands, threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, and being only 3 parts full, he then saw for the first time around the inside, some 6 inches from the top. There ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was old and faded bloodstain. He uttered a scream, drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same time, the kit bag gave a faint, unmistakable lurch towards the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received the weight just in time to prevent the falling, and shut with a resounding bang. At the same moment, the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric light switch, and the light in the room went out.
It was an awkward predicament, and if Johnson had not been possessed of real pluck, he might have done all manner of foolish things. As it was, he pulled himself together and groped furiously for the little knob to turn the light on again. But the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it a-swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror, 2 things happened that sent him into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his efforts to find the switch on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, but even then, in those frenzied moments of alarm, he had yet to realize that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. The impulsive thought yielded automatically to the original desire, and the room was flooded with light once again. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness, for there, close before him, bending over the half-packed kit bag, clear as life in the merciless glare of the electric light, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. Not 3 feet from him the man stood, the fringe of black hair marked plainly against the pallor of the floorhead, as vivid as he had seen him day after day in the Old Bailey when he stood there in the dock, cynical and callous under the very shadow of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it all meant. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly, dismembered fragments forced with lime into this very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. It all came back to him clear as day. Very softly and stealthily, his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door. But before he could actually turn it, John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, that heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulated somehow into words, "It's my bag, and I want it." Johnson just remembered clawing the door open, then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room.
He remained unconscious for a long time, and it was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards. Then the memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind, and he promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time, the wintering dawn was just beginning to peep at the windows, painting the stairs a cheerless, dismal gray. He managed to crawl into the front room and cover himself with an overcoat in an armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamor woke him. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. "What? You ain't been to bed, sir? Are you ill, or has anything happened? There's an urgent gentleman downstairs to see you, although it ain't even 7 o'clock yet." "Who is it?" he stammered. "I'm all right, thanks. Fell asleep on my chair, I suppose." "Someone from Mr. Wilbrum's. He says he ought to see you quick before you go abroad, and I told him." "Show him up, please, at once," said Johnson, whose head was whirling as his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbraham's man came up with many apologies, and explained briefly and quickly that an absurd mistake had been made. The wrong kit bag had been sent over the night before. Henry somehow got a hold of the one that came from over at the courtroom, and Mr. Wilbraham had only discovered it when he saw his own laying in his room, and asked why it had not gone to you. The man said, "Oh," Johnson said stupidly. Excuse me, I have a cat in my lap, making it difficult to read. And he must have brought you the one from the murder case instead, I'm afraid, the man continued without a ghost of an expression on his face. The one John Turk packed the dead body into, Mr. Wilbraham's awful upset about it, sir. He told me to come over first thing this morning with the right one as you were leaving by the boat. Bedtime story. He pointed to the clean-looking kit bag on the floor, which he had just brought, and I was to bring you the other one back, and the other one back to him, he added casually. So for some minutes, Johnson could not find his voice. At last he pointed in the direction of his bedroom. Perhaps you would kindly unpack it for me, just empty the things out on the floor. The man disappeared into the other room and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard the shifting to and fro of the bag and the rattling of the skates and the boots being unpacked. Thank you, sir, the man said, returning with the bag folded over his arm. Beg your pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought maybe you'd like to know what happened. John Turk killed himself last night with poison immediately on getting his release, and he left a note for Mr. Wilbraham saying he'd much be obliged if they would have him put away, same as the woman he murdered in the old kick bag. What time did he do it? Asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder says.
The end.
Dun dun dun.
Dun dun dun. So, yes, that was The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood.
Yep.
Very kind of creepy, spine-tingling tale that revolves around the Christmas season. Mm-hmm. And it's very typical of those kinds of ghost stories that were, being told all over the place back in the Victorian era, when people would gather around, just like we are here in front of the fire, and having
kittens crawl in your lap.
Bedtime stories, and everybody is loving you. This is Una. If you haven't met her before, this is Una. She's about 6-7 months old, so she is.
She and her sister look very similar. Her sister's a little bit darker gray, and she doesn't have a tail.
Yeah, she's over here minding her own business in the chair behind me. So, Patrick says the moral of the story is don't go to law school or work involving working with or against murderers.
But you see some things you don't want to.
Yes. But yeah, that was story 1 of 2 that we have for you tonight. Now, if you haven't heard of Algernon Blackwood, you have most certainly heard of this next author, though you may not have heard of the story. As a matter of fact, we've already talked about him once. Yep. It's going to be Mr. Charles Dickens. Now,
I found another one that was cool.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Now, he, of course, was a very prolific writer, most well-known today for Christmas Carol. But, yeah, he wrote a lot during his time. Many, many stories. As a matter of fact, he actually had a literary magazine, a weekly periodical for a number of years, that was called All the Year Round. And he founded this and owned it himself, and this next story was published in that periodical in 1866. It was the Christmas edition of All the Year Round, and it is called The Signalman by Charles Dickens. Hello! Below there! When he heard a voice thus calling him, he was standing at the door of his box with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But, instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. It was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. Hello! Below! From looking down the line, he turned himself about again and raised his eyes, saw my figure high above him. Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you? He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though it had force to draw me down. When the rapid train had passed me, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause, during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out.
The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitous. It made through a clammy stone that came oozier and wetter as I went down. You're making it very difficult to read, sweetheart. I can't see the light. When I came low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, waiting for me to appear. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped for a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my descent, stepping out onto the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, and saw that it was a dark, sallow man with dark beard, rather heavy eyebrows. His post was a solitary and dismal place as I had ever seen. On either side of the dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view except for a strip of sky, the perspective of a great dungeon. The shorter perspective in either direction terminating in a gloomy red light and a gloomier entrance to a black tunnel whose massive architecture there was depressing and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck through to chill me as I had actually felt like I've left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to have touched him. Not even then, removing his eyes from the mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. It was this lonesome post to occupy. A visitor was a rarity, and I should suppose not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me, he merely saw a man who had been shut up with narrow limits all of his life, and who, being the last, set free. I had newly awakened interest in these great works, and my purpose was to speak with him. I am far from sure of the terms I used, but there was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look at the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and the look all about it, as if something were missing from it, and then he looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know it is?"
The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I've speculated since whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn, I stepped back, but in making the action I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear." His manner cleared like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. He had much to do there. Yes, he had enough responsibility to bear. Exactness and watchfulness were required of him, and of actual manual labor he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then was all he had to do. Regarding those many long, lonely hours, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into a form he had grown used to. He had taught himself a language down here, to know it by sight and crude pronunciations. He had also worked at fractions and decimals, and tried a little algebra, but he was a poor hand at figures, depending on times and circumstances. He did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but at all times listening for his electric bell to call, he didn't stray far.
He took me to his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book, in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse the remark that he had been well educated, and perhaps educated above that station, he had been when a young student of natural philosophy, had attended lectures, and he had run wild, misused his opportunities, and gone down, never to rise again. He threw in the word "sir" from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though as though to request me to understand that he had claimed to be nothing more than what I saw. He was several times interrupted by that little bell. He had to read and reread off messages, send replies, and once he had to stand without the door to display a flag as a train passed, and to make some verbal communication to the driver in the discharge of his duties. I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse without a syllable and remaining silent until he had done what needed to be done. In a word, I should have this man down as one of the safest men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a falling color, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened up the door to the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and to look out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions he came back to the fire with inexplicable air upon him.
Said I when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man."
"I believe I used to be so," he rejoined in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir. I am troubled."
He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?"
"It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of. If you ever make me another visit, I will try to tell you."
"But I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?"
"I got off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 o'clock tomorrow night, sir."
"I will come at 11. He thanked me, and I went out the door with me.
"I shall show my white light, sir, till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out, and when you are at the top, don't call out."
His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well."
"And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry out, 'Hello, below there,' tonight?"
"Heaven knows," I said. "I cried something to that effect."
"Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well."
"Admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below."
"For no other reason?"
"What other reason could I possibly have?"
"You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in a supernatural way?"
"No." He wished me a good night, and held up his light. I walked by the side down the line of rails until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here's mine." With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire.
"I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper, "that you will not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me."
"That mistake?"
"No, that's someone else."
"Who is it?"
"I don't know."
"Like me?"
"I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved, violently waved, this way."
I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. "For God's sake, clear the way."
"One moonlit night," said the man, "I was sitting here when I heard the very voice cry, 'Hello, below there.' I started up to look up from that door and saw this someone else standing there by a red light near the tunnel, waving just now as I showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, 'Look out, look out!' And then again, 'Hello, below there, look out!' I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, 'What's wrong? What has happened? Where?' It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel, and I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping of the sleeve across its eyes. I ran up at it and had my hand stretched out to pull away the sleeve, and it was gone."
"Into the tunnel?"
"No, I ran into the tunnel, 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head and saw the figures of the measured distance. I saw the wet stains sealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again faster than I had run in and looked all around the red light and with my own red light. and I went to the iron ladder to the gallery atop it, and I came down again, and I ran back here, and I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back both ways. All's well.
Resisting the shiver tracing up my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight. As to an imaginary cry, said I, but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind in the wires, he who so often passed long winter nights there alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. He slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened, and within 10 hours the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where that figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me. It was not to be denied that this was a remarkable coincidence, but it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account in dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure, I must admit, men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not yet finished.
This, he said, again laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over his shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock when one morning, as the day was breaking, I, standing at that door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me.
Did it cry out?
No, it was silent.
Did it wave its arm?
No, it leaned against the shaft of light, and both hands were before the face, like this.
It was an action of mourning. I've seen such an attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it?
I came in and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone.
But nothing followed? Nothing came of this?
He touched me on the arm with his forefinger once or twice, giving a ghastly nod to each time. That very day, as the train came out of the tunnel, I noticed at the carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver. Stop! He shut off, put his brake on, and the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, heard a terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and it was brought here and laid down on this floor between us.
Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards at which he pointed to himself.
True, sir. True. Precisely as it happened, and so I tell it to you.
I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The winds and the wires took up the story with a long lamenting wail.
He resumed, Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since, it has been there, now and again, in its fits and starts.
At the light?
At the danger light.
What does it seem to do? He repeated that former distillation of, for God's sake, clear the way.
I have no peace or rest for it. It calls to me for many minutes together in an agonizing manner. Below there, look out, and stands waving to me, and it rings my little bell.
I caught at that. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here and you went to the door?
Twice.
Why, see, I said, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell and my ears were open. It did not ring at those times, nor at any other time except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head.
I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost rings a strange vibration in the bell that derives from nothing else. I have not yet asserted that the bell stirs to the eye, and I don't wonder that if you had failed to hear it, but I heard it.
And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out?
It was there.
Both times?
Both times.
Will you come to the door with me and look for it now? He bit his under lip as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step, while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stairs above them. "Do you see it?" I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so perhaps than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot.
No, it's not there.
Agreed. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking about how to best improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions.
By this time you'll fully understand, sir, that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean?
I am not sure.
What is its warning against? He said, ruminating with his eyes on the fire, and only times turning to them to me. What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is a danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time after what has gone on before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do?
He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead.
If I telegraph danger on either side of me or on both, I can give no reason for it. I should get into trouble. They would think of me as being mad. But this is the way it would work. Message. Danger. Take care. Answer. What danger? Where? Message. Don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do?
It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life.
I can't see. When I first stood under the danger light, why not tell me what that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on the second coming it hit its face, why not tell me instead she's going to die? Let them keep her at home. If it came on those two occasions only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? Am I, oh Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on the solitary station? Why not go to somebody with credit to be believed and power to act?
When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to this post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 a.m. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway. That I did not like the red light, and that I would have slept poorly if my bed had been under it. Nor did I like the two sequences of the accident and the dead girl. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration how I ought to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure. I had provided the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. But how long might he remain so in his state of mind? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or two after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I walked the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down. From the point which I had first seen him, I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when close at the mouth of the tunnel I saw the appearance of a man with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, and for in a moment I saw that his appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft a little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, I descended in the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What's the matter?" I asked the man.
"Signalman killed this morning, sir."
"Not the man belonging to that box?"
"Yes, sir."
"Not the man I know?"
"You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end to the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed.
"Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again.
"He was cut down by the engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. The man that drove her was showing how it had happened. Show the gentleman, Tom."
The man, who wore a rough dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel.
"Coming around the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as I saw him down the perspective glass. There was no time to check speed. I knew him and to be very careful, and he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle. I shut it off when we were running down upon him and called to him as loud as I could call.
"What did you say?"
I said, 'Below there, look out, for God's sakes, clear the way.'
I started.
It was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put my arm out before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was of no use."
Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the danger of the engine driver included, the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached in that only in my own mind to the gesticulation he had imitated. That, ladies and gentlemen, was The Signalman by Charles Dickens. This sad tale of the unfortunate signalman who was plagued by a poltergeist, a premonition of his own unfortunate end.
Yep. And there's a lot more of these out there, and most of them are actually public domain at this point. They're over 100 years old. So you can definitely check them out and see what other ones you can read for yourself this holiday season in front of a fire with a kitty in your lap.
Donnie says Una is spoiled.
Oh, yes.
That
she is a princess, and she knows it. And she's not happy with the boy Foster.
Oh, no, she's not. Neither one of them are. Well, thank you, everybody, for the compliments. Great storytelling. Thank you so much. But yes, that does wrap up our Christmas, Victorian Christmas stories, at least for this year.
Yes, we'll do it again next year, because as I said, there are tons of stories out there, and I've started gathering up other stories, including the anthology. I was actually able to find that online for free. So we'll take a look at a couple of those and see what we can come up with next year.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe we'll see about doing something maybe a little more in person. I know we have our friends down at Richmond. Last year, we actually went and did an
abridged version of Christmas Carol down there.
So we read Christmas Carol down there last year and had a great time doing that. COVID.
Yeah.
But
so we'll see about maybe doing it next year for them a little bit before Christmas Eve.
Yeah, I think we did it on like the 18th or the 19th last year. But in any case, we'll see.
But we will be back first week of January with werewolves, because that has been a request.
And then after that, we also have Glenn's request. We are going to be doing we're going to be doing stories of state parks, but our center, our
Yeah, I'm going to try to find some news stories on Point Lookout.
Point Lookout. Our cornerstone for that's going to be Point Lookout per the request of our good friend Glenn here. So, yeah, we got our next couple are all set up.
And in February, I'm going to do presidential ghosts because that's just fun. And, well, it's President's Day in February, so.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, that's... talking 2021, heck, we won't see you again, at least not on here, until 2021.
So, any other comments? Because I know there are a lot of them.
Yes,
I could not read them on this screen.
Yes, and I haven't been able to keep up with my reading, but lots of best wishes for the new year. We'll take a few minutes after we're off the air here to go ahead and respond to some of them.
Yep.
But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. This was a lot of fun. I love doing this. I'm so glad that we started doing this.
Yeah.
In fact, on top of the fact that it just simply kept us sane when we started doing this.
And it's definitely been keeping me busy with the research. So.
Yes, which we have, found our redeveloped, our new love, our rekindled, rediscovered our love for the research, which is something that is always good to dig into the history books and the archives and see what's around.
I have to buy books.
Darn, our entire library that we're staring at behind the camera over there, just a wall to wall ghost stories.
And then there's the wish list on Amazon.
Yes, there's all that too. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. One last thing, I suppose, we got a Venmo. We got a Venmo now. So if you would like to send something over, we greatly appreciate it. Of course, Haunts of Richmond is not just something that we do to come here on the air and to we of course have a lot of fun coming on the air and telling these stories, but it is also part of our livelihood, and we actually just took all year, but we finally got around to setting up a Venmo. So if anybody is would like to leave us a little something, you can go ahead, and if you have Venmo, you can go ahead and send it over. We are at Haunts of Richmond on Venmo. It's really kind of weird. Or you can simply use the email that we have set up for that, which is hauntsofrichmond@gmail.com. So you can look us up either way on that, and I'll probably go ahead and drop a little something in the text, the chat as well. No obligation, of course. We just appreciate and we're very thankful for all of you tuning in. You've certainly helped keep us sane through the year. Yeah. And
just think about it as buying research material for us.
Yeah, we have certainly...
Because I have a list of like 25 books I want to buy.
Yes, we have certainly spent a little bit on our research library this year.
There are times I get told to stop buying.
I haven't told you that.
Yes, you did.
When did I tell you that?
You told me to wait until you paid the bill.
That's different. I didn't tell you to stop buying. Just said that's to let me pay the bill. Anyways, enough of that. So, again, thanks everybody for tuning in. Now I'm just kind of rambling, so we will go ahead. We will wrap it up. Cheers, everybody. My glass is empty, but cheers.
Clink.
Have a Merry Christmas. Have a Happy New Year. We are always here, so if you ever want to go ahead and drop us a note, please do so. Yep. We'll be happy to go ahead and converse with you, not just here on our lives, but also anytime you want to drop us a note.
Yep. Stay safe with the upcoming weathers.
Yes.
And stay safe with the upcoming whatever else is going on in the world. And with that, we will see you the first week in January. January, is it 4th?
First, second, third. Yeah, I think it's the 4th. I think it'll be January 4th, but just like we did for tonight, we will, of course, be going ahead and setting up a
January 4th.
A Facebook event for werewolves in 2 weeks. So, with that, everybody have a good night, and again, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Cheers.
Cheers.